The first thing I'm going to do is apologise for not including otters and hedgehogs in the last video about animals. And then I'm going to answer some questions, as I said I would do a few weeks ago. I said I'd do it at uni, but I was unable to record at uni, so I thought I'd quickly put that in now before I release the next video, which will be about Louisiana accents. So the first question is from Charlotte Marceau, and she asks, what will future English look like based on historic sound changes? And a few people have asked this in comments or in emails, and I think it possibly comes from the fact that I once used the word predictable to describe sound change, and that probably wasn't the best word to use. So what I mean by predictable is that a given sound is only going to change in a certain number of directions, and it's only going to change immediately to a sound that's similar in some way. So oo is not going to change to ah in one single step because they're very far apart. They're completely dissimilar in terms of articulation. Oo could front, it could become u, it could become or, which would be lowering. It could centralise, but it could not immediately jump to ah. So there are only a certain number of ways a sound can go in the short term, and then the long term it could make a change to any number of different places of articulation. So what I mean by predictable is that we can look at historical texts and we can say, based on the fact that I know this sound can only change in a certain number of ways, in a relatively restricted number of ways in the short term, what does spelling evidence tell us about which one of those ways is the one that most likely happened, if you see what I mean? So if you knew that at some point in the history of English you had the sound oo in the word house, and you know that now in English you have obviously the ow sound, you can look at spelling evidence and look at the small amount of evidence of people who've actually described phonology as it existed when they were alive, and you can reconstruct the process by which oo changed to ow in most dialects. So oo initially became something like oo, which is almost a monophthong but just slightly diphthongized, slightly broken. And then the difference between the initial sound in the diphthong and the end of the diphthong, oo, oo, expanded slightly, so that became oo, and then that became o, and then eventually ow. So you can reconstruct those intermediate stages if you have a pretty good idea of what the initial stage was, and that's a completely different thing. Like that's determined in a very different way. That's probably very unclear, but yeah, we couldn't use that method to determine what future stages of English might sound like because we don't know which of the relatively limited number of directions the sounds that we currently have are going to go in, if you see what I mean. So the word team, as in a team of people, could go in any number of ways. The E could round to U, so you could have tomb, or it could lower to E, so you could have tame, or it could diphthongize to A, so you could have tame. And although there are a relatively limited number of ways it could go, there are still a number of ways it could go. And in the next 100 years, those ways could, or the next 1,000 years, those ways could stack up and stack up and stack up. And you have a kind of butterfly effect where it, although there's only a certain number of ways it could go in the next 50 years, say, there are 1,000 different possible outcomes over in a few centuries from now. So we can't predict how it will sound, and the further we try to go into the future, the less certain that will become. There are a couple of questions about Scots, and one was from an account which I'm not going to try and pronounce, which was about the borderlands and determining where Scots starts. I assume that's geographically. Historically, dialects in northern England have more closely resembled dialects in southern Scotland than perhaps they do today. So although to somebody who's not very used to British English accents, northern English dialects might sound similar to southern Scottish dialects, there are huge differences between the two, and there is kind of a hard line. Like, there are very few people that I would describe as having a half Scottish, half northern English accent. I think it's mostly either one or the other. So there's clearly a very strong distinction between the two nowadays. Train, hang on. Yeah, there's clearly a very strong distinction between the two nowadays. Historically, I think the distinction's probably been less significant because if you look at a 19th century text from Cumbria and a 19th century text from Dumfries that are attempting to convey the speech of the area, you will see much less difference, although that might just be because you're only seeing spelling evidence, which doesn't necessarily reflect phonology as well as an audio recording would. But you certainly get similarities in terms of grammar, in terms of vocabulary and things like that. So I think in the past it was probably a lot less of a sudden jump than it is nowadays. You could probably call Northern English dialects of the past dialects of Scots if you wanted. But really it's just a dialect continuum going from south to north that's much more pronounced. There's a much more pronounced division nowadays than there was, say, 150 years ago. The other Scots question was from Simon Aiton, and it was along similar lines of how it relates to the modern Northumbrian dialect continuum. And also he asked about my opinion on the recent Scots Wikipedia fiasco, and this is in reference to, I think, the Scots version of Wikipedia, having been a huge amount of it was written by, over the course of about 10 years, an American teenager who had basically taken, as far as I understand it, taken the English Wikipedia articles and gone through each word with a Scots translator or dictionary or something, translating each word, which is not the way you get an authentic Scots outcome. And many people are obviously very critical of this, and it's done a huge amount of cultural damage, and it's lessened the seriousness with which people take the Scots language. It's made people, if people are only getting their input on Scots from Scots Wikipedia, then they're going to think Scots is just English but spelt strangely. So that's really not a good impression to give people. On the other hand, I don't think the person should be attacked, for what they've done. Obviously, they meant well. They've released statements saying they're extremely mortified. I don't know if they've released statements, but they've responded to people who've approached them saying they're extremely mortified about what's happened. They were clearly trying to do something good and culturally, helpful. They did not do that. They failed to do that. But at the same time, I think the intention is important here, and the person who did this should not be attacked or I just don't think it's very compassionate. They started doing it when they were very young. And they clearly just got into the habit of doing it without really thinking too much about it. But then I'm not a Scots speaker, so I'm not culturally invested in that in the same way a Scots speaker would be. So I don't know. I would just say, hopefully that person can take that dedication and put it towards something less culturally damaging in the future. And I wish them luck, and I wish the Scots community luck rebuilding their Wikipedia. Something just flew over. Sazji, or Sazyi, I don't know how to pronounce that, asked, when did the consonant at the start of the become voiced rather than voiceless? And that's in reference to, I think, the fact that in Old English, a lot of words that nowadays have voiced interdental fricatives, so like this, that, the, in Old English had voiceless interdental fricatives like th instead of the. Because in Old English a word could not start with a voiced interdental fricative, the, because there was a phonological rule surrounding the and th were both allophones of the same phoneme, and that phoneme could not be voiced at the start of a word. I don't actually know when this change happened, so I think everything I've read has put it in the early Middle English period. I'll put a correction on screen if I'm wrong there, but I really don't know how it happened or when it happened, so sorry about that. Well, that confused me. Someone whose name is My Channel asked if I could address how the various accents of English came about, like Yorkshire and Cockney and Scouse and so on. And that is, as you say, a very big question. It's hard to answer in a single video. I'll probably do videos at some point in the future about Scouse accents and Cockney accents and things like that. But what I would say for the time being is that these accents became different just because of sound changes adding up over time, and slowly, they diverged from each other, and also just because of slight vocabulary changes and things like that. These things just accumulate over time, and regions that are far away from each other just develop their own dialects and accents that way. Somebody else whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce asks what program these videos are edited with. It's DaVinci Resolve, which I think is still free, and it's very good. I don't use it to its full capacity, but it's a very good program for editing. Eigenvector Normalized asks if I've ever read The Wake by Paul Kingsnorth, and I have. I enjoy it very much. So it's a book that's set across the Norman conquest, and it's written in sort of modern English, or something that's syntactically modern English, but with Old English spelling and some aspects of Old English structure as well. I think Paul Kingsnorth's aim when he wrote it was to tell an Anglo-Saxon story in something resembling the language of the Anglo-Saxons, because I think the logic was it's hard to accurately convey a sense of culture without kind of using aspects of the language. It's very hard. It's very hard to do that without obviously just using a language that the reader won't be able to understand. So it's a very nice medium, and it's also, I think it's probably useful for learners of Old English, people who want to learn to read Old English, because although it doesn't help with the pronunciation because it's only a written book, it does help with the sort of interpretation of Old English spellings. So you can kind of read it, and if you get used to the spelling conventions in The Wake, you might be able to interpret the spelling conventions of actual Old English a bit better. So it's a good book, and it's a good story as well. Jack Hitchcock asks where I think the North begins from a linguistic point of view, and this is the North-South divide, and exactly where the line is a very big point of debate between Northerners and Southerners in the UK. So some people, a lot of people think they live in the North, but then somebody from a bit further north will say they don't live in the North, and so on. From a linguistic point of view, unfortunately there's no clear answer to it, because there's no sudden line where a load of northern features suddenly appear. Northern features kind of appear in steps as you go up further north. So the southernmost feature that I would describe as northern is the lack of a foot strut split. So where I live, which is Guildford, which is quite far south, the words foot and strut don't rhyme. They have different vowels, ah. And if you go beyond a certain line, which I think is kind of around Leicestershire, Derbyshire kind of area, or it might be a bit further south than that, the words foot and strut actually start to rhyme, like foot and strut, although the vowel qualities, the exact qualities, might differ depending on where you are. From the perspective of a southerner, anyone around here would probably say someone from Leicestershire or Derbyshire sounded very northern. Anyone from Cumbria or Preston or Yorkshire might say, why Preston as if it's a county, Cumbria or Lancashire or Yorkshire might say that somebody from Derbyshire was very southern sounding. So I think that's probably the first point of debate, the first point of dispute, is the foot strut split. Although there are other features of northern, specifically northern English, that appear as you go further north. So there's no immediate point above which it's definitely linguistically the north, below which it's definitely the south. My dad always said the north starts at Shap Fell, which excludes most of Yorkshire and all of Lancashire. So I think some people might find that one a bit excessive. Mimi asks how I became interested in linguistics, and it's not actually something I remember. It would have been the last 6 or 7 years, but I can't remember. I really can't remember exactly how it happened. I think it must have been from it might have been from a paleoanth point of view, like I got into the evolution of certain things, and then I got into the evolution of language, and then I thought, what's the history of modern English? Or it might have been from a dialectal view, because my grandparents are from Cumbria, and my great uncle and aunt are from Devon, or my great uncle's from London, but has lived in Devon most of his life. And it might have just been me noticing the sort of diversity in my own family and thinking that's interesting. You know, where's that all come from? But I can't remember, unfortunately. Swan Levitt has asked a question, who's a musician, and I'd recommend giving his music a listen because it's very good. He asks whether your ancestors' language can have an effect on the structure of your vocal tract that influences what sounds you can pronounce. Now that does not hold up. So there are a lot of reasons why we might find it easier to pronounce some sounds than others, but a healthy child will be able to pick up any language given enough exposure to it. There's really not... Language change happens much, much faster than biological evolution and adaptation happens. So to give an example, English about 6,000 years ago, probably less than that, 5,000 years ago, was Proto-Indo-European. And that's miles away from English, phonologically speaking. But that's really not enough time for any actual evolution to have happened in. So noticeable biological evolution happens over a period of sort of tens of thousands of years, not thousands of years. So the reason as an adult you might find certain sounds difficult to acquire is just that as a child, I mean, even children find sounds difficult to acquire and might take years to acquire certain sounds. And as a child, you have more of an incentive to learn sounds, because if you can't produce sounds, then you can't communicate effectively. Whereas as an adult, you already have a native language, you can communicate effectively, you don't have as much of an incentive. So it might be something to do with that. Or some people just can't produce certain sounds just because, you know, even children in languages with alveolar trills, ra, can just not get the sound until they're in their teenage years or later. So it might just be that certain sounds are harder to pronounce than others. But it's not an evolutionary thing. Norbert Thomas asks something that's been asked a few times, which is, when I speak, why do I add r sounds in to certain words? So he gives the example of the word drawing. And this is something called linking R, which is when there are two syllables next to each other, one of which ends in a non-high vowel, so a vowel that's not E or U, and the next syllable begins with a vowel, then people with certain non-rhotic accents like mine will insert a r sound between them. So that happens with drawing, because or is a non-high vowel and I is a vowel. Ing rather starts with a vowel, so drawing will acquire that linking R, the r sound in the middle. I don't know if that happens in US non-rhotic accents, so if anyone has any intel on that, they can comment it. And finally, Chris Samis asks about my archaeology interests, which I don't normally talk about on here. I like paleoanthropology, which is the study of ancient humans, which I've done a couple of videos on. But what I did in my dissertation last year and what I'm doing in my master's dissertation this year is zoo archaeology, so the study of animals on archaeological sites, mostly livestock. So last year I did sheep, this year I'm probably going to do pigs, and I might be incorporating stable isotope analysis, which is analysis of obviously stable isotopes that you can use to determine what animals were eating and possibly where they came from, where they were brought up as well. So that'll be very interesting, but it might be a bit, I don't know if it's the kind of thing people on this channel would be interested in listening to, but it's an interesting thing. It's like the minute detail of daily life thousands of years ago is just very interesting, and it kind of stems from the same interest as the language thing, I think. Sorry I was unable to get round to all of them, and I'm also sorry that I've rambled for a lot of that video. It's going to be quite hard to watch a lot of it, I think, but the next video will be better structured, so I will see you then. Thank you for watching.